can you define for all of us what is estrangement?
I mean, people define it in different ways. That's part of the problem with the research that's been done. The way that I think of it is it's a cutoff in a relationship that may be temporary, may be permanent, but where it's not just people getting out of touch. It's where one person, because typically it's one person wants it and one person doesn't. More typically, it's initiated by the adult child, because that's my area of specialization is with parent-adult child estrangement. Um, and the parent doesn't want it, the adult child does. So I think of it as either a complete cutoff or a near to complete cutoff.
How common is estrangement?
Well, apparently it's very common and getting more common all the time. A recent study out of Ohio State said that 26% of fathers are estranged from their kids. The same studies found 6% of mothers are, but other studies have found that closer to 10 to 11% of mothers are estranged from their kids. But if you expand it out away from just the parent adult child to family members in general, then something like 27% of families in the U.S. are estranged from a family member. So it's incredibly common. I think growing more common all the time.
Why do you think it's growing more common?
I think it's a variety of reasons. I think our culture is becoming more identity focused, more tribalistic, where we have kind of in-group, out-group ideas, and that no longer includes family. I think the notion of family has radically changed. Where, say, prior to the 1960s or so, there was the idea of honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, families forever, and that's really been turned on its head. Where increasingly the idea is that of chosen family, the family who you make it, that people don't owe their parents anything, that the most important thing is the preservation of my happiness, my well-being, my mental health. So there's always been estrangements, but never before have they been based on the idea that it's actually good for one's mental health, or it's even an act of existential courage to cut off a parent or a family member. And it's tied to what the sociologist Anthony Giddens talks about as the evolution from role to self. Whereas it used to be there were very clear ideas prior to the 20th century, arguably before that, but where kind of the ideas about what it takes to be a member of a family was fairly clearly defined: being a good parent, being a good child, etc., being a good adult child. And then it changed much more towards an orientation towards self. So what Giddens talks about is that we've had the evolution of what he calls the pure relationship, where relationships are now purely constituted on the basis of whether or not that relationship is aligned with that person's ideals, their goals, their aspirations for happiness, etc. And if they're not, then the relationship is viewed as being problematic and corruptive and not worth pursuing.
You see it all over social media. Like if you
Oh,
look at like
exactly.
all of the like just put a post up and you're like, "Oh, if they had cut them off, toxic behavior."
Exactly
And
right.
what do you want us to know before we even jump into this topic of an intentional cutting off of a relationship with a family member or a friend? What do you want us to know about the reality of relationships, the dimensional reality? What is true about relationships that last and what relationships are meant to be about?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and there's probably no really easy answer to that. The way I think about it is both at the community level and at the individual level. I mean, at the community level, I feel like we as a culture are really suffering. We have high rates of mental illness, we have high rates of depression in particular, loneliness, social isolation, increasing atomization, increasing tribal view. So we're really kind of coming apart at the seams. It really feels like we're living at a time when our culture is falling apart. So at the community level, I think that family is an important part of that aspect, and that people should do whatever they can to prioritize family and family relationships. That said, I don't believe that people have to do it at any cost. There are family members who are very destructive, who are very hurtful, who aren't willing to make amends, to take responsibility. I mean, most of the people that I work with are the parents, and my whole method is around that you have to take responsibility for the things that have caused your child to turn away from you. And if you don't feel like you understand, then you have to pursue empathy and understanding and compassion. But from the adult child's perspective, I would like to see more compassion for parents, that parents typically do the best that they could do, given what their own social, economic, temperamental resources were, their own childhood traumas, etc. And they deserve a certain period of time of being able to work on the relationship and to have a hearing and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the general way that I would think about that.
So, Dr. Coleman, I'm fascinated with how you got into the work of counseling and supporting parents who are estranged from adult children. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to do this?
Sure. I mean, I was married and divorced in my 20s and have a fully grown daughter who I'm very close to. But there was a period of time in her early 20s where she cut off contact for several years in large response to my becoming remarried and having children in my second, and which is my current marriage of some 30 plus years. And there were many ways that she felt displaced by that, hurt by not so much the divorce because she was so young, but just by all the kind of things that can happen with divorce and remarriage and being a blended family and the like. And at the time, there was nothing really written to advise me or help me. I was in therapy at the time trying to get help, and the advice I got was terrible, as it often is.
What was the advice that you were getting
Well,
that
the
was
advice
terrible?
was just kind of like, you need to remind her of all the things that you've done for her and correct her memories and just show up at her place and kind of, demand that she see you. And all those things are, they just, none of them really caused her to feel understood or cared about or, like I had any degree of compassion for what her experience was. So it really wasn't until I just learned how to stop explaining, stop defending, stop blaming, and respect where she was coming from that things began to turn. But during that time of estrangement, it was easily the most painful, awful, disorienting thing I've ever been through or ever hope to go through again. The idea that, I don't know if you have children, Amy, but the idea that your child would cut you off and you would may never see them again is horrifying, painful, and terrifying as well. So once we did have a reconciliation, I thought, well, there's so many people struggling with this. I wrote my first book on the topic in 2007, When Parents Hurt, and as a result of that, I got a wide following of parents here and in other countries who are dealing with this. On the basis of that, I developed a system of webinars that I still do, a free Q&A every other Monday. And as a result of that, I did a research study of 1,600 estranged parents that's been published in numerous academic journals, and wrote my most recent book, Rules of Estrangement, Why Adult Children Cut Ties and How to Heal the Conflict. As a result, I'm also now have developed a training program for therapists because there's a huge need, which hopefully will be live in the next week or two. People can visit my website if they were interested in training or learning more about that.
So, let's talk about that moment of estrangement. What typically drives, and I'll focus on adult children since that's your area of expertise, but I'm sure that all these themes apply to friendships where there's estrangement, all kinds of relationships where there's estrangement.
I agree.
What are the factors that typically lead someone to say, that's it, I'm going to cut my parents or somebody else out of my life?
Yeah. There's a number of pathways. If you look at the surveys of adult children, what they typically will say is emotional abuse, physical abuse, neglect, differences in values. Those are the most common things reported by the adult child. But other pathways are divorce, in my own, obviously my own personal experience, but also statistically, in my own research study and in my own clinical practice, 70% of the parents have been through a divorce. So there's a number of ways that divorce can increase the risk. One is it may cause the child to blame, of any age, to blame one parent over the other for the divorce. It can bring in new members, step siblings, half siblings, new stepmothers, stepfathers have to compete for emotional and material resources. It may cause the child to support one parent over the other, even if the parents don't need to have that kind of support. Finally, in a highly individualistic culture like ours, it could cause the child to see the parents more as kind of individuals with their own strengths and weaknesses and not as a family unit that they're a part of. So divorce is a clear risk. Mental illness in the parent, but equally mental illness in the child, in the adult child. the role of therapy, bad therapists or therapists that just aren't very well educated in this, who assume that every problem that surfaces in adulthood has a childhood trauma at the heart of it, which isn't necessarily true, but so many therapists believe that and put the adult child on the pathway to estrangement.
Hold on a
Some,
second. I just want to
yeah,
make sure everybody hears that. So you're saying that there are lots of therapists out there that take whatever their client is telling them and run with it
yeah,
and basically facilitate the linking of childhood issues with estrangement being something that they should consider?
yeah, consider or do. I mean, I've had numerous parents show me letters from adult children where they said, "Well, my therapist said that you're a narcissist and you can't change, so I'm not willing to do family therapy with you." And these are often therapists who've never met the parent. They're diagnosing the parent from afar. And more problematic, they're assuming childhood traumas that may or may not exist. I mean, childhood traumas are a real thing. But in this day and age, there's the assumption that if somebody has a problem in adulthood, well, you just have to figure out where the childhood trauma lies, and then the doors to identity and happiness and meaning will be open. But that's really problematic. I mean, we're really preoccupied with traumas at this point in our culture and society in a way that's really causing a lot of harm.
So I'm sure that as people are listening, there's a bazillion bells going off. And so I, of course, want to go, okay, well, let's talk about childhood trauma and all this stuff, but I want to stay in this topic because I personally believe that everybody listening has had either an experience with estrangement or they know somebody who is really struggling because of estrangement. And
Yeah,
I can think even in my own family that when my uncle died, he had never met two of his grandchildren
wow,
and just how helpless I felt
yeah,
about trying to, like, wishing somehow that could have been repaired
right,
before he died and knowing the heartache and the frustration and the anger and the sadness and the grief that
yeah,
happens when somebody makes a decision to cut you out of their life and
yeah,
you don't even really know why.
right.
And so, is that like for a baseline? How do you know if this is a situation of estrangement versus just busyness? And I don't really like that brother of mine, so I don't really call him very often, but he does get the Christmas card from us. Like, what actually, how do you know you're in the boundaries of somebody has deliberately cut you out?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. It's not, the answer isn't at all obvious. And I think that a lot of parents today end up getting more estranged because they're wanting more closeness from their adult child than the adult child feels capable or desiring of giving. And so often, and there was a survey done out of the University of Virginia that said that a majority of parents raising children um, want and expect to be best friends with their children once they're grown. And it's great work if you can get it. But a lot of adult children don't necessarily want that level of closeness or intimacy. And one of the problems with social media, can be another pathway to estrangement, is that it allows a certain kind of intrusion of the parent on the adult child that they might not want. So I think a certain percentage of estrangements occur that wouldn't have occurred in the past because the adult child could just sort of organically become who they are, develop independently, develop their own voice and autonomy without parental influence. Whereas now parents can reach their adult child, anywhere in the world within a matter of seconds. And so I think a certain percentage of adult children feel very crowded today. What's the most common complaint I hear in every single estranged adult child's letter is, you need to respect my boundaries, right? So boundaries have become the most important thing. And it's in part because parents raising children over the past 4 decades are more worried. They're more worried about getting their children through the narrow bottleneck that can land them in a successful life. They're worried about the world that their children are inhabiting. So parents have become more anxious, more guilt-ridden, more intrusive, more surveilling. And that doesn't always work in the parent-adult child relationship in the long term. Um, So to circle back to your question, the it may not start out as an estrangement. It may start out more as kind of normal distance. But as soon as the parent starts to act too victimized or hurt or criticizing the adult child, then they're putting themselves on the path to a potential estrangement.
I can personally say there was a period in my relationship with my mom who I love deeply, and I know
Yeah.
she loves me. And as I look through the family history, both on my mom and dad's side, they have, I guess, somewhat kind of complex arm's length relationships with their family.
Uh-huh.
Love, but not hanging out all the time. And part of it is physical distance.
Mhm.
And there was a period of time where I was newly married and I was so enthusiastic about my husband and about his family. And
Mhm.
we were living closer to my husband and my husband's family. My
Yeah.
parents are in the Midwest, they're on the East Coast, and I know it was an extraordinarily painful period for my mom because she, from a distance, felt like she was losing me to another family.
Yeah. It's very common.
And I started to sense that resentment or that fear, and that
Yeah.
started to, upset me.
Yeah.
And so we got into a period of time where we didn't know how to come together.
Yeah.
How, she would say something, I would get offended. I would say
Mhm.
something, she would get offended. And it felt
Yeah.
like our relationship had all of these landmines that neither one of us wanted there.
Yeah.
I just wanted to get back to that, like, I just love you and you
Yeah.
just love me. And I could see that without me doing a tremendous amount of great therapy and without us even having almost like a period where we tolerated each
Mhm.
other, that it could have led to a disastrous and hurtful situation for both of us because we're both very opinionated. We have big
Yeah.
emotions. We're very similar. And
Mhm.
we didn't know how to navigate this without hurting or upsetting the other person. And so I think at least when I and I'm so grateful it didn't end up differently because I feel
Right.
closer to her now than I ever have.
Mm.
But I can see how kind of it's almost like when people separate before divorce, I always kind of
Mhm.
roll my eyes and I'm like, what's the point here?
Sure.
I can see how just going, I'm not going to call them. I'm not going to pick up the phone. I'm not going to go visit. I'm not going to do this. That sort of de escalation
Mhm.
can lead to something like this.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I
Is that what
agree.
you've seen?
Y- Yeah, you're saying that the de-escalation can actually help, that it can provide.
I think it
Uh,
can help on some hands, but I could
yeah.
see how not talking to somebody
Yeah.
for a month
Yeah.
or 2 months or a couple months and just kind of being that sort of cold, uninterested, distant, I could see how that would actually throw gasoline on the fire because
Oh, for
the
sure. Yeah.
emotions actually build. And then
Right.
every interaction is so high stakes,
Hmm.
it's a recipe for disaster.
Right. Yeah, no, I think you're putting your finger on a couple of important things. When I was talking about the pathways to estrangement, I didn't list one of the most common pathways, and that's when the child marries. The adult child marries, and if there's conflict between the son-in-law or daughter-in-law and the parents, sometimes the son-in-law or daughter-in-law basically says to their spouse, "Choose me or them. You can't have both." And men in particular are vulnerable to that. But you're also putting your finger on the fact that the parents can commonly feel like, well, how can the other parents get to spend more time with you or the grandkids? And in some ways, sons are more at risk. The parents of sons are more at risk of that because of what sociologists refer to as the matrilineal advantage, which means statistically, daughters are more likely to kind of prioritize their own family over sons, etc. Um, but that is a really common source of estrangement or beginning conflict. And to your point, that once conflict starts, it can quickly spiral out of control and lead to an estrangement. And for parents, I think most parents feel kind of panicky when the adult child starts to pull back and be more distant, become less available, and that causes what John Gottman refers to as the pursuer-distancer dynamic, where the
What is it
person is
called?
he talks about it from a marital research perspective, the pursuer-distancer dynamic, and it's associated with a high risk of divorce, where one partner, more typically the wife, is pursuing the other for more contact, more intimacy, more communication. And the other person, more typically the husband, pulls back more, becomes more shut down. And over time, that dynamic gets more rigidified and harder to change until the couple splits up. Well, a similar thing I observe with parents and adult children around estrangement, where the parent starts to pursue more and more and more. Why aren't you calling me? Blah, 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 and then they're off to the races.
If there was ever a podcast episode to listen to, I think it's this one, because I think the research is wrong. I think that at some point this is going to impact all of us. What am I talking about? I'm talking about estrangement.